See, common North American green rating systems.
That's good, but it's better to start on slide one, just so we don't get too far ahead. We got to all. Thanks, folks, for being here and bearing with us a little bit. I think we all agreed, Greg and Sworn and I, that this one came together a little bit more haphazardly than some of the other ones. And sorry, we've been we've been wildly busy. All three of us have kind of been slammed, truth be told. Um, so thanks for jumping in. I feel like sort of a broken record on this, but we had a very productive call at the end of last year for Carbon Leadership Forum in Austin. That essentially we, I'm going to admit myself from the waiting room again, um, where we brought up some topics people wanted to talk about in this through this year in our meetings, and I think through sort of kicking things back and forth, one of the things that came up was looking at green rating systems and how sort of embodied carbon plays into those. And we've talked a little about LEED in these calls, and I'll run through that very quickly, but we thought it would be interesting to hear from ILFI, International Living Futures Institute, to hear about sort of where they are on embodied carbon, and usually ILFI and the Living Building Challenge and some of those programs are pretty far out in front on a lot of things. And so we thought that would be very cool. And also locally to Austin, Austin Energy Green Building, AEGB, is coming out with a new rating system soon. And I know Martine was involved in building out some of that language, and we thought it would be cool to sort of have a a sort of a national view and looking forward with International Living Futures, and then sort of a local view on AEGB and what if some of those changes sort of coming down the pike. So just very quickly, we wanted to kind of open this up, common North American green rating systems, and a lot of these that we talk about, obviously, in my life, LEED is a big one. There's a little bit of WELL that's involved, and then sort of the different varieties of living futures, and like I said, some of the Living Building Challenge, which I'm somewhat familiar with. I should say, and actually Swarna sent this out. I'll open this up. Can you all see this? Am I still sharing, or did I just share? You can see the SE 2050 website.
Yep.
Okay, great, cool. So this was actually, and we can put this link in the chat, but this is SE 2050 has put something together that sort of goes over these green rating systems to some extent, and sort of really in an organized way will tell you what some of the embodied carbon portions and criteria are within some of these. So the well building standard we'll talk about. Well, that's a bad pick because well is on healthy interior spaces. So I don't know if they have any EPD stuff, but well's probably not the best example. But obviously, LEED and some of the work in Living Futures is here, and like the LBC, some of the petals and some of the imperatives, and it talks about, it lays these out. So again, I think this is a really great link, and being on the architectural side, I'm a little less familiar with some of the SE 2050 website changes, but this is super helpful. So we'll put this link in the chat. Please favorite it. You can always sort of come back to these to see where folks are in the criteria. So what we wanted to look at again was sort of common North American green rating systems plus AEGB being sort of the local here in Austin, and sort of introducing these to you all very quickly. I wanted to talk through sort of LEED, which is a little bit more common in my world. I was saying I just finished an LCA for LEED like last night, this morning, and how that works. In the LEED version 4.1 is usually the credit that we sort of go after in the LEED world. There are multiple paths. The first three have to do with a whole building LCA, and we've done some presentations on sort of how we do that, looking at one click. There are a few other ways to do it. I'm a big tally user just because that's been common, and being an architect, having used Revit for so long. But essentially, gaining 1 point in the system and the criteria for running a whole building LCA, when they're, you can look up the credit. There's certain things, structure and enclosure obviously are included in at least 3 of the 6 impact categories that LEED looks at. If you demonstrate a 5% reduction between a baseline building and then your design building, you can gain 2 credit points. And if you have a 10% reduction, you can gain 3 credit points. And these calls, we've talked a little about the difference between kind of baseline and proposed buildings. And, you know, I don't know if Dirk is on here, but, you know, Dirk and even Martine, you can probably, you know, talk a little bit about what those could be. But I generally, just in the spirit of the credit, try to think through what decisions did we make in design to lower embodied carbon, and what those decisions generally are becomes sort of the difference between what your baseline building would be versus a proposed design. And you kind of run 2 whole building LCAs and compare them to one another. And then in path 4, it's sort of a material reuse that you can use for structure and enclosure. And I think I've only done this once, and it was literally sort of a looking through the model and kind of mapping out portions of the building and the design that were being salvaged or reused, and then working through some of those percentages. That's not exactly the whole building LCA, but that is if you are doing full-scale renovations and things like that. So obviously for 4 points in that path, there is a lot of incentive to reuse existing structures and existing buildings, which is great. The other way, obviously, are doing the whole building LCA paths, and we have even done it where we've included sort of renovated spaces inside of those to say, as if there was a proposal to, why don't we tear all this down and build a new building? If we instead preserved it, you can sort of run those numbers as a baseline versus proposed in a whole building LCA. So I'm sort of going quickly through this just because I think the LEED world is a little bit more common, and I think we all might be a little bit more familiar. And I obviously want to sort of get to our speakers, but I did want to put a little bit of energy on that so folks know. And obviously we'll sort of have these slides, and I know this is being recorded. So quick logistics before we get to our speakers. We have, again, a very cool website, thanks in large part to Swarna. So CLF Austin has one, and we have the signups, and I think we show some of the past events, and we'll sort of show this event, and then links to our pages for these presentations, the YouTube links for those. So sort of everything is there. And again, you know, kind of favorite this link. Next meeting, August, September. I think that's about right. It'll probably be a last Thursday. And I think it feels like August is right around the corner. So I'm like catching my breath from putting this one together, but I think it's the end of August or early September or something like that. So if you sign up for the mailing list, you should be getting, we don't necessarily have MailChimp. There's a little bit of manual labor, but we're getting everyone who signs up in, so you can get these announcements and jump in for these calls. So with that, I'll kick it to our speakers. Just typical sort of Zoom rules apply, as I always say. We'll put some links in the chat. We're going to just run screen share through folks. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat, or feel free if it needs to be clarified right away. This is pretty informal, so jump in if you want to. If not, we'll kind of hold questions to the end. Yeah, is there anything else that I'm forgetting on the logistics side? We want to keep folks to about 25 minutes or so we can have a good 15-20 minutes for questions. So Aubrie and Inonge from International Living Futures Institute are here to talk a little bit about that and what the sort of embodied carbon story is there. And then we will kick it to Martine to talk about who now is a PhD student, but had previously worked at Austin Energy Green Building and is a structural engineer, so knows a lot about this stuff. We'll kick it to Martine to talk about AEGB and some of those changes upcoming in sort of the credit language and how embodied carbon plays into that. So without further ado, I will hand it over and stop my share.
All right. Let me see if I can get my share going.
Okay.
And hello and good morning, everybody. Thanks for having us. Let's see. Are you seeing a screen yet?
See the web page, it's not in presentation mode yet.
Okay. We're used to Google Google Meets, so I can't see what you guys are seeing yet. If there's any tips on how I can see that, let me know. Otherwise, I'll just go ahead. So are you guys seeing the presentation mode now?
Still the presenter view. I'm not sure if like on that slideshow drop down, if that will let you change the mode.
Yeah, I think if next to slideshow, Aubrie, if you hit the down arrow, I think there's a presentation, like a presenter mode versus not in the web page.
Oh, I see. You're looking at the, let me.
Yeah, you might just hit slideshow and see what pulls up.
Okay, let's see. Is that better?
Yes.
Still is that still presenter mode, or is that good?
We're seeing the slides now. It's not quite a full screen view, but I think it will work.
Yeah, I think it'll work.
Not sure why it's not full screen, but all right, let's go ahead and kick it off. Again, thank you for having us. We're excited to be here. So we'll be talking about the Living Building Challenge, Zero Carbon, and the Regenerative Building Movement. So my name is Aubrie Christensen, and I'm the manager of innovation at ILFI.
And I'm Inonge. I'm a specialist of the buildings team at ILFI.
So we're going to talk, I'm going to introduce kind of ILFI and what we do and some of our programs, and then I will talk really quickly through LBC and CORE, and just an overview of the basic imperatives. And then I'll hand it over to Inonge, who's going to go a little bit deeper into zero carbon, and then we'll kind of finish up with just a overview of where ILFI is headed and where we kind of see the regenerative building movement headed. So ILFI's mission is to lead the transformation towards a society that is socially just, culturally rich, and ecologically restorative. We have 4 building certifications: the Living Building Challenge, Core Green Building Certification, Zero Energy, and Zero Carbon. We have 1 product certification, the Living Product Challenge, and then we have 2 labels. They're transparency labels, which are, if you're not familiar with them, they're kind of similar to a nutrition label for food. We have Declare, which is a product ingredient transparency label, and then we have Just, which is an organizational equity label. So that is where organizations can share their transparency on HR practices, employee benefits, health and well-being, DEI practices, stewardship, and purchasing practices. So we have projects and labels in over 30 countries. This is our impact as of early May in 2020. So some of these numbers have increased. Specifically, Declare just surpassed 1,000 labels. So we have 60 living product certifications, over 1,000 Declare labels, over 150 Just labels, 82 certified living buildings around the world, 85 zero energy certified buildings, 4 zero carbon certified buildings, and then we have over 550 projects that are pursuing one of our certifications right now. So ILFI's programs are kind of intended to be visionary, holistic, and inclusive tools for transformative design. All of our projects, whether pursuing Living, Pedal, or Core certification, must comply with the requirements of all 10 core imperatives. It's an all or nothing certification, so you're not allowed to pick and choose. You have to do every single imperative. Core is a framework outlining the 10 best practices achievements, recognizing that LBC is really challenging. And so it's a starting point for those projects that have significant barriers to LBC. And then Pedal certification requires all 10 core imperatives and then the full either water, energy, or materials pedal. And LBC, of course, requires all 20 imperatives. And then the other thing that kind of sets our certifications apart from others is that they're fully performance-based. So final certification requires that projects show 12 consecutive months of building performance before submitting for final certification. We recently kind of created a new option for projects to get recognition earlier on in the process. because we understand that sometimes that 12 months can stretch into years if you're kind of troubleshooting and you have a lot of other things going on in your project. And so projects can now get a ready audit, which is essentially all of the documentation and imperatives that don't require performance data. You can submit for all the documentation for those imperatives and kind of get a stamp saying, okay, you're ready to go. As soon as you get that performance data in, you can go through final certification. So I'm going to talk quickly through the Living Building Challenge. And again, I'm going to go fast because I want Inonge to have more time to focus on carbon. So LBC really aspires to show that regenerative buildings are possible, meaning buildings that give back more than they take. They're inherently good instead of less bad is kind of our thing. So all imperatives are required for full certification. And then as I go through these, the core imperatives all have a C next to them. So place is really about ensuring that every project is rooted in the ecology of their place, both ecologically and socially. There's 4 imperatives here: the ecology of place, which is a core imperative, urban agriculture, habitat exchange, and then human scaled living, which is also a core imperative. Water is, to be fully net positive water for full LBC, a project has to capture and treat all the water used on site in a closed loop system. There are exceptions that recognize this is impossible due to codes and regulations or just kind of site specific circumstances. But the idea is that it should be a closed loop system. And so there are 2 imperatives in water. Responsible water use is a core imperative, and then net positive water is for full certification. So energy is pretty straightforward. To get fully certified, a project has to produce all of its own energy used on site using renewable sources. We have 2 imperatives here. Energy and carbon reduction is a core imperative, and then net positive carbon is for full certification. And so Inonge is going to go a lot deeper into our carbon programs. So you'll learn more there. Health and happiness is really about recognizing that the impact and relationship between the places that we live, work, and play and our physical and emotional health and well-being. So there's 1 core imperative under health and happiness, the healthy interior environment, and then healthy interior performance and access to nature are required for full certification. The materials pedal is often what a lot of project teams say is the hardest pedal to achieve. So the materials pedal focuses on eliminating the use of toxic chemicals and products in our buildings. The market really isn't 100% there yet, which is why it's so challenging. But we really have made great progress, and that's shown in our over 1,000 declare labels that we have to date. There are several imperatives under the materials pedal. Responsible materials is a core imperative. The red list is, if you're not familiar with the red list is a list of kind of worst in class chemicals that we prohibit in our projects that are going for full certification. It's a very extensive list. I think this number has increased, but there's over 700 chemicals on that list. And then responsible sourcing, living economy sourcing, and net positive waste are all also required. So equity is another pedal that we were kind of some of the early certification or rating systems that really incorporated equity in our holistic approach to sustainable building. Equity, we're pushing for inclusive built environments, connection to communities, and ensuring that all people have access to living buildings, and that really they're not just for those that have the financial means to afford them. So there are 2 imperatives here. They're both core imperatives: universal access and inclusion. Beauty is the last pedal. Incorporating beauty, biophilia, and connection to nature into the design process from the beginning is required. And then for education, again, these are both core imperatives, beauty and biophilia. And then education and inspiration is really about inspiring others by sharing experiences through case studies, tours, and other kinds of educational information. So I'm going to hand it over to Inonge now to talk about zero carbon.
Thank you. So Zero Carbon was created as a tool for organizations to demonstrate credible climate action through their build projects. It requires projects to demonstrate measured carbon neutrality in the project's operational and embodied carbon emissions. Next slide. So the program is structured around 3 key strategies, which is first to reduce operational and embodied carbon emissions through design optimization, the use of efficient combustion-free building systems, and the responsible selection of materials. Secondly, to disclose the actual energy consumption of the building and the embodied carbon of the installed materials and construction process. And finally, to offset all carbon emissions associated with the project through the procurement of renewable energy, carbon sequestering materials, and carbon offsets. And so this slide kind of goes through the general requirements for embodied carbon. It's a 10% reduction from in primary materials compared to a baseline, to offset 100% of the embodied carbon from construction and materials. And then we have the 500 kilogram CO2 equivalent meter squared threshold. And then for the operational carbon aspect, we have teams need to achieve a performance-based EUI target. No new combustion is allowed, and then to offset 100% of the operational energy with on or offsite renewables. And then for, I guess, the specific EUI targets for new buildings would be a 25% reduction from ASHRAE 90.1 2010, and then existing buildings show a 30% reduction in EUI from an equivalent existing building of comparable size. And they can use approved baselining tools like Zero Tool. But for the purpose of this discussion, I'm going to focus more on the embodied carbon piece. So next slide, please. So I'll just briefly discuss some like the key process elements of zero carbon and kind of what goes in, what teams will, I guess the process teams will need to include as they pursue certification. Next slide. So the first piece is a baseline LCA and hotspot review. So the key tool and process in calculating and comparing low embodied carbon materials is through a life cycle assessment. So teams will need to use an LCA calculator tool that can complete a whole building LCA to calculate the aggregated carbon emission impacts. We have a list of already approved tools that we feel are, do a good job of being able to do that, like OneClick, Tally, EC3, which are kind of commonly used in the community. And you can find more in the Zero Carbon Handbook. So we require teams to complete an LCA of stages A1 to A5, so the product and construction stage of the primary materials of the building, so the foundation, structure, and enclosure. And then the embodied carbon baseline needs to reflect a building design that is identical to the proposed design, with the exception of the claimed reduction measures. And so, yeah, you can also use, the LCAs or these different tools to compare material options and select low embodied carbon materials. And then once all materials are finalized and procured, the team will conduct a final LCA to document the project embodied carbon. And so that's kind of the key deliverable, is a copy of input assumptions and final results from the selected LCA tool. And then next slide. So the next slide is, or the next part is a carbon reduction narrative. So the team will need to document actions taken to reduce the project embodied carbon, including primary material reduction strategies. So, as mentioned in LEAD, reuse is a very effective means to reduce a project's overall embodied carbon. So the team, if they are able to, reuse in situ materials, any kind of salvageable materials, they can count that or towards their, reduction strategies and list that out and document it. And I guess the key part and why this is a key part of the zero carbon is that teams are showing intentional actions are taken to reduce their embodied carbon. So the project team should provide a comparative embodied carbon evaluation or carbon-based specifications for material or product alternative to document this intention that embodied carbon reduction was a core element of their design. And then next slide. And then this just kind of goes on about low embodied carbon material procurement, specify carbon as selection criteria, and then request product-specific EPDs, especially if you find a material that doesn't have an EPD. We encourage teams to request them from their manufacturers, get more, so we can have more data and kind of push manufacturers to be more transparent. Next slide. Yeah, and then the final aspect, so we want teams to prioritize reducing embodied carbon, meet that 10% reduction minimum or even more, but there's still going to be some embodied carbon impact related to their project. So teams will need to then, use an approved carbon offset to cover the total embodied carbon of the project, so including impacts from construction and from new or refurbished materials. And these carbon offsets need to be third-party verified. Okay, next slide, please. So this is just kind of an overview of the general kind of deliverables that teams will need to provide. So the reduction narrative, the embodied carbon data, and the carbon offset documentation. More detailed documentation can be found in the handbook, but there's kind of like an overall look of what teams will need to submit. And next slide. Yeah, and then this is just kind of an overview of how embodied carbon is incorporated across the program. So you can see for zero carbon, it's 10% from the baseline, and for core and for the energy, for LBC energy pedal, it's 20% from baseline. For interior materials, we're yet to have a defined reduction target just due to limited data. So, we're really encouraging teams to have a lower than industry average. And if they are able to find, specific data, we encourage that. And we're hoping in the future, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that we're able to have more defined guidance for interior projects and more defined targets. And then zero carbon, the main difference is the 500 kilogram cap. So this is from the CLF benchmark study that was conducted in 2017, which is an assessment of 1,000 typical buildings. And we recognize this might be very low for some carbon intense projects and not high enough for other projects. But we're hoping that this threshold can provide some form of a framework for projects to not only look at embodied carbon reductions, but to evaluate and assess the total embodied carbon impact of their project. And we know that CLF is in the process of updating the study, so we're very much looking forward to those results. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, so just briefly discuss the future of carbon, especially as it relates to ILFI strategic plan. One of our goals is aligning all of the programs, all of our embodied carbon requirements across the programs and making it clear, like having clear guidance for teams to confidently move between programs, so that if projects achieve zero energy or achieve zero carbon, they feel like they have the necessary resources and knowledge to move on to core or, to try LBC in their next project. The next other key, goal that we have is to have an energy and carbon technical advisory group. And the key focus areas regarding embodied carbon include setting building specific targets. So as I mentioned, that interior reduction requirement and having more guidance for existing buildings, particularly because we do want to recognize the benefit of reuse. And we want to make sure that we're supporting and providing as much clear guidance on how existing buildings can account for embodied carbon reductions and take even additional steps to reducing embodied carbon. And then the next part is the carbon cap. As mentioned, it's not perfect, but we're hoping that it can provide a framework and we'll have more guidance around that. And then the final part that we hope the technical advisory group to look at is the carbon offsets, and making sure that carbon offsets are verified and that we can identify equivalencies, especially to Greenie climate certification, which is what we currently use. And we also want to explore alternative new and innovative carbon offset approaches, including the assessment of soil enhancements and other strategies that teams can account for the total embodied carbon impact. And then finally, I would say the next goal is scaling our programs, especially zero carbon. Zero carbon is the goal of zero carbon is that it can work at a larger scale, and we're hoping to work with leading organizations such as tech and real estate organizations, higher education, to align and implement our zero carbon certification across their global portfolios, and really kind of see how zero carbon is possible at a larger scale, and kind of work through some of the complex issues that kind of come in with trying to do a zero carbon project at a really large scale. Yeah, next slide.
Thank you, Inonge. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our new strategic plan and where we're headed. So ILFI just completed a strategic plan that was published back in May. It's available on our website for anybody to read. There's kind of a short 2-pager summary, and then there's a longer, I think it's somewhere between 15 and 20 pages. But our strategy over the next 3 years is really focusing in 3 core kind of areas of work. One will be strengthening our foundation. We're going to be doing that in 4 key areas. One is zero carbon buildings, regenerative product procurement. So that's really focusing on LPC and declare, and then social justice and diversity in the building industry. So that's focusing more on our just label, and then kind of how that wraps around to all of our programs, and then biophilic design. And then we plan to widen our circle to be more inclusive to building owners and developers, higher education, and to expand our critical buildings program. So some of you may be familiar with our affordable housing program. It's been a really great success over the last several years, and we're hoping to expand that to reach out to more critical buildings, specifically, those buildings in communities that support the critical functions of communities, such as public schools, community centers, and places of worship. So we'll be using our affordable housing program as kind of a model to expand into those areas. And then we also hope to catalyze exponential impact by investing in timely levers for change. These include developing model policy language. Policy is something that we've kind of dabbled in over the last several years, but have never really put a real focus on. So we're hoping to do more of that, and building a community of advocates to help advocate for that policy change. And then we'll also be launching our Living Buildings as Beacons for Local Change initiative. And this initiative is really about using existing buildings, so we have certified buildings like you saw in one of those early slides around the world. And so we want to know how we can use those existing buildings to really catalyze and inspire change in their communities, and kind of serve as those beacons in communities. So ILFI has been a leader in envisioning, celebrating, and convening through our challenges, certifications, and conferences such as Living Future. So we're going to continue using these tactics to grow our community, and we're going to be focusing more on recruiting, education, policy, and advocacy work moving forward over the next few years. So we've also historically leaned more heavily on the climate and health aspects of our mission. And so we'll be putting a lot more emphasis and efforts towards the equity part of our mission, and working specifically to kind of work at that intersection of all 3. And we also recognize there are many, many great organizations out there that are doing really great work, similar work to what we're doing. And we look forward to doing a lot more collaboration with those organizations on our programs and our work. We want to work more deeply with organizations and people who are committed specifically to social justice in the building industry. And we'll be devoting resources to the regenerative building movement, organizing action on climate, health, and justice in the built environment. I'm going to hand it back over to Inonge to kind of talk about some ways that you guys may be able to get involved if you want to learn more.
Yeah, if you're not already a member, we encourage you to join. Membership offers opportunities to connect with others in the community of over 2,000 members, discounts, and members only access to program resources and events. And I really appreciate, the membership community, because we can discuss, really important topics. So if we have a member discussion board, if you want to talk more about kind of your, embodied carbon strategies, or have more expertise in a particular area that you want to share, we definitely welcome that. And then next we have Living Future accreditation. So if you want to expand your knowledge and kind of learn more about our particular pedals and those particular subjects, get your LFA, you can find more information on our website and our education platform at education.living/future.org. And then we have our first ever Living Building Challenge Case Studies Summit. It's a 2-day online event. So get on the list to be notified when registration opens, and sign up to that QR code that's there. And this 2-day online event, you'll learn lessons for achieving each pedal of the Living Building Challenge directly from key project team members who worked on some of the most inspirational LBC projects to date. And then, come work with ILFI. We have positions open. So if you have, if you want to be part of the community, if you have more to show in these particular areas, we definitely welcome that. That's the end of our, thank you all.
Yes, thank you. And we can share links that I noticed there's some chats. So we can share some links. Oh, looks like they've already been shared. Thank you.
The real Thomas Gibbons has been trying to keep up and put some links out there. That was great. Before we get to Martine, I did want to say, Inonge, your background, while Aubree's is beautiful and we get it, you're not in Texas and it's not 1,000,000 degrees and it's fantastic. And Inonge, your background is actually the Bullitt Center, is it not? Which is a living building. Is that correct?
Yes.
Fantastic.
I should have started with that. I'm in the Bullitt Center.
You're in the Bullitt Center. There you go. That's very cool. So that's like a famous building, obviously, in my world, having been an architect and been into this stuff for a pretty long time. It's I mean, as I said, the sombrero is pretty distinct, but it's a very cool building, and I've seen photos of the inside, and it's super cool. So so thanks. Yeah, we've shared a bunch of links. I don't see any questions yet, but feel free, folks, and we can come back at the end if we want to revisit anything. So with that, so Martine, kicking it to you, and you will tell us a little bit about what's to come in the local Austin energy green building world with embodied carbon.
Absolutely. And I probably could have planned this better and put myself with the flat irons in Boulder at the background. But in lieu of that, I do have this cute picture of me on a hike to share. Are you all seeing are you seeing presentation version, or how's that looking?
No, it looks good. Yeah, presentation version. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, so the reason I share this is not just a last minute addition of my jealous background from the friends at ILFI, but also just a reminder of like, hey, like, why are we doing this? What is the point? Nature's super fun and beautiful. I know we'd all love to protect it. Don't forget to get excited about what we're protecting. But in the world of sustainability, there's this really strong desire to be inclusive, comprehensive as comprehensive as possible, which I don't doubt is well-meaning and it's a great endeavor, but sometimes this can go too far. This can distract from our highest priorities, sort of losing the forest for the trees. And so to demonstrate what I mean, I'll use what's hopefully a familiar example, LCA. So in LCA, there are all these kind of different environmental impacts, right? So there's global warming potential, embodied carbon, that's the carbon emissions that we all know. There's acidification potential, there's smog formation, there are these other ones that we consider. Because when we look at the points, it's always like, hey, we need to have the carbon reductions, but also make sure you include some of these. And so when I was first learning about a lot of these, I think it's kind of inherent, is they're really tough to compare. But some people have had a crack at comparing them. So the EPA has had a crack at establishing these kind of weighting factors, as has the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. And in addition to that, there's been a normalization factor done by Tracy. Tracy kind of creates the methodology. So first I'll show the normalization factor when we compare some of these. So basically what this graph is showing is the impact as a proportion of per capita impacts. So basically relatively how many, like what is the per capita impact as the US? How does that distribute and what does that look like on a building scale, right? So this is a normalization factor. It's not looking at the relative importance, but rather the relative impact. However, the two from NIST and EPA that are actually looking at the relative importance. So basically what I did, I took some data from some LCAs I've done and I ran the numbers, got the conclusions. So they're sitting at around 1% and 3% of the importance when you're looking at actual impacts on a couple buildings. And this is about a dozen buildings that I had done. And so they're all sitting at like 3% and 1%. And so the reason that I share this, and this is something that I learned after I was working on the rating presentation, so it's not included. But the point that I want to make is it's easy to lose the forest for the trees. And it's really important that we keep in mind what are the more important actions we can take and how can we make sure we're maximizing those efforts.
So sorry, Martine, real quick. Let me talking to the mic. Don't tell the Great Barrier Reef that you showed this to us, by the way. So AP, I'm sorry, acidification potential, EP eutrophication potential,
And
Is that
smog,
right?
smog form, yeah.
Smog
Acidification
form
potential,
Right.
eutrophication
Yeah.
potential, smog formation
So when we
potential.
run the LCA, yeah, to your point, you
Mhm.
get a bunch of different results back, and whether it's one click tell, it's similar to the EPD. The EPD runs through these 6 or
Mhm.
7 or 8, I can't remember, depending, but they're like 6 main ones, they're a couple, and they walk, global warming potential, all the P's, the potentials, smog formation. So in the creation of these elements in your building project, there are potentials via their production to increase eutrophication, acidification, that kind of stuff in the environment. And they kind of somehow figure that out and measure that in the creation of the EPDs. Add all those together in what you're building, you get a whole building life cycle assessment. So you're saying that we have proportional impacts from Tracy per capita, but when you are trying to weight them in the grand scheme of things, we're seeing some lower numbers.
Mhm.
Not to say that you shouldn't care about those things, but I don't know. Let's say it right here since we're recording, Martine. Are you saying that we should weight better in the world if you get lower or more reduction of global warming potential? In a rating system, it should be worth more. Is that kind of where you're going with this? In a
Yes,
sense,
100%.
not putting words in your mouth. Not saying that we should change the lead, but it's like, say you got an 11% reduction in global warming potential, which is not regenerative by any means, but we're trying, we're getting there. The more we can do, the better, blah, blah, blah. But then you only got a 2% and a 3% eutrophication potential reduction, et cetera. You think that perhaps we should be more, it should be recognized that we got a pretty high percentage of reduction in global warming potential, because in the future, in our upcoming future, the GWP is going to be a pretty big deal. Higher rated. Is that kind of where we're going with all this?
Yes, 100%. And
Okay,
so that's
sorry.
something where another point that I'll reiterate later is sometimes there is a bit of a disconnect between what is rewarded through rating systems and what is actually the best thing to do.
Fair. Yeah.
Sometimes you can get away with bad
Gotcha.
practices and still get lead platinum. Sometimes there are ways to kind of skirt the system. And so this kind of disconnect, or it's important to keep in mind. So I want to just make sure we're highlighting what should we actually be doing and how can we actually translate that to a building.
So when you invite the PhD students into the talks, you get the data. The data starts flying at you. I like this.
This. But I mean, to be clear, this is also not to say that any attempt to be comprehensively address environmental impacts and sustainability isn't valuable. I'm not saying that. I'm rather highlighting that you need to consider this balance and you need to consider what the data is showing.
Yeah.
So a philosophy like this should complement and enhance comprehensive efforts like what ILFI is doing. So I'm not just here trying to talk smack. I'm just trying to say, hey, we need to strike this balance, because I do think the work that's happening at ILFI is really brilliant. Oh, there we go. So what we want to do is we want to better when we're trying to take this to a rating system, we're trying to better incentivize the most effective embodied carbon reduction strategies, right? And again, I'm focusing on embodied carbon, not operational carbon. That's my expertise. That was kind of my task. So when we look at some of the behaviors that we want to highlight and encourage and incentivize and reward, the first one is don't build at all, which is a really tough one to reward through a green building rating system. But if we kind of work through some of these strategies, you can see that they progress through kind of the design process. If you're in DDs or CDs, it's tough to go back to don't build at all. But when you're in that sort of figuring out what we need phase, we could refurbish an existing building, use what's already there, because then you're just completely avoiding the embodied carbon emissions, right? Because the building's already there. Keep it small and simple. So build as smaller as possible, build simpler, don't do anything crazy. That'll require, if you have all these transfer girders and cantilevers and wild stuff, that ends up using a lot of extra structural material. So your baseline ends up being pretty bad. And then you can design for disassembly or reuse. So make sure that the embodied carbon that you're spending for this building is actually going to have a life beyond the building life. And then there's using lower carbon materials, using better design strategies, kind of optimizing from there. And then a bit of a break, make sure you think about all those things and then offset carbon. Because it's having those tangible reductions is a lot more important than relying on offsets. Not to say offsets aren't great, they're very important and are a necessary part of our climate action, or what we should be doing, but should be a last resort. So when we think about how these relate to a green building rating system, not building it all, like I said, is super tough to reward. If somebody is about to build a building, they convince the owner like, hey, maybe we don't actually need this. All right, LEED super platinum, you did great, you didn't build anything. Like there's not really much we can do. That's not a lever we can pull. But a lot of these other strategies we can measure, we can perform LCAs, we can look at what we're actually doing, we can measure these reductions through things like methods like LCA and something like an EPD, where you're looking at like the nutritional stamp of the building material. So for concrete or steel or whatever you're using. So the reason that I highlight that is while we should be proportioning our efforts according to the most effective outcome, like I was saying at the beginning, we also need to consider what is big, tractable, and neglected. Those are the most important problems for us to solve. The reason that I mentioned that is if a problem isn't big, then it's not as worth solving. This is part of proportioning your efforts to the outcome. You need to focus on the heaviest hitters. So focusing more on GWP versus acidification potential. Tractable, meaning, and I used to say solvable. The reason I changed it to tractable is like something you can do about it. There's a lever that I can pull that will fix this. Because if we're just kind of identifying a problem and there's not really anything we have control over, then it's really tough to pay attention to. Not to say we can't think about it more rigorously, but again, focusing on what levers we could pull them. And then also what's neglected. Are we going to have a rating system that's rewarding something that everybody's already doing? Well, an example of that would be something like recycled steel, like specifying a percentage of recycled steel. A lot of people are already doing that, and a lot of that can fall on like the shape that you're using, and so that kind of specification isn't necessarily what we need, but rather looking at the shapes and the manufacturing facilities and different things like that. So Austin Energy Green Building Rating System. This is kind of the big map, and it's a lot to take in. I don't know if we're sharing these slides, but I just wanted to provide that as kind of a beginning reference. We start with a number of things. I had first edits, and then we have a final product. So let's dig in. I'm going to take these kind of piece by piece, and hopefully you'll see how the philosophies I've outlined are getting applied. So my starting point for the AEGB rating system, I'm going to do I know it's a lot of text, but I'm going to try to take it one by one. So additional construction waste management. We can either, and this is as it stood when I first had a look at it. So you could either divert 75% of your construction and demolition waste, or use recycle and salvaged construction or materials. That should say materials. Another point, building material use reduction, that has a couple different options. So 1 point per 20% of building area reused. This has a bunch of different options. You could perform an LCA. This is similar to the point that I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with, what Tom was outlining at the beginning. Or you can use cradle to cradle certified products for 2.5% of the cost of the building material cost for the total. Another point, another credit, sustainably sourced material. Sourcing the material from a salvage refurbished, or making sure it's in Texas. Certified wood, making sure it's FSC certified. That's basically a stamp that says this is coming from a sustainably managed forest. And then using materials without PVC, or this word that I can't pronounce because it's outside of my scope. So this is my starting point. Now my job is to kind of take everything that I've talked about, apply it here, try to incentivize the best practices, right? So what I did, and what we looked at was with the response to that point, a lot of people were hitting the 75%. So we can just increase that to 90%. The building material use reduction, I split into a bunch of points. And so what I really wanted to introduce was incentivizing existing buildings. And because we saw how valuable that can be. Through an LCA, if we have a new construction, you get your 10% or 20% reduction, and most of that's coming from the building. If we reuse a building, that's 100% reduction, right? Or 90% reduction. And so that's wild. We should be incentivizing that. And the points should be represented allocated according to how significant that is. So that having a heavier emphasis on existing building is a separate point. More points for LCA. So not just saying do an LCA is 1 point, 5% is 2 points, but let's start that at 3. So doing an LCA is 3 points because it's such a valuable tool. 5% is 4 points, 10% is 5 points, et cetera. So we're just kind of ramping that up. And then also incentivizing EPDs. So especially somewhere like Texas, we're really lacking in EPDs, and we've made a lot of progress in this field, but telling or having some sort of incentive to ask for product specific EPDs, get that product specific stamp on your materials is really going to help larger scale reductions, and a lot of other teams get reductions because we need those really big data sets. And then also awarding points for material-based reductions verified by those EPDs. Sustainably sourced material, that kind of gets lumped in with these LCA and EPD credits. Certified wood, we added that it should also come from North America. There's some concern over the fact that certifications in other countries might be kind of working their way around the system and getting an FSC stamp, even though they might not actually be FSC certified, like there's a bit of corruption or whatever. The word that I can't pronounce, we moved to indoor environmental quality because it was scary to me. Low carbon construction site. This is a point that we introduced just to identify like, hey, like what if we incentivize using emission-free equipment, right? So what if we're addressing the emissions that are actually happening? Because it's not the most significant, but we should consider all the levers that we can pull. And then designing for disassembly and reuse. So in your design document, say, hey, this is how I'm going to take this building apart at the end of life and how we can reuse all these materials. This is tough to do, but it has been done. It is certainly possible. And extending those building material or the building material life beyond the life of the building saves you that embodied carbon. So it can be really exciting. So these are my first edits, looking at what actually happened. So what we're looking at right now are like the most recent version in March. So the existing building LCA point was not included. I think this is just the scope of the credit saying like, hey, well, we're looking at new construction. Let's focus on those sort of reduction strategies. Kept the extra points for the LCA. So just doing an LCA gets you 3 points because that's behavior that can open the door for so many different exciting ideas. EPD points changed it a little bit. So you can have a couple different options, provide EPDs for your concrete mixes because it's such a high volume, high impact material. And then 1 point per 20% of materials by cost or GWP. And this, I think, is a really important point of ultimately, if people are all performing LCAs on all this stuff, we can proportion our efforts according to the impact, not by the cost, not by the area, not by any of that, but by the impact, because that's really what we want at the end of the day. We're trying to reduce the impact. So if that's where we keep our focus, then that's a big win. Certified wood, removed the addendum about North America. It was deemed not as important, but added a little stipulation for tropical hardwood, saying, hey, if you're using tropical hardwood, don't use some of these alternatives. Low carbon construction site also not included. There are only so many points that you can dole out. So you kind of have to proportion to most effective strategies and the ones that you're going to be able to check. The construction demolition waste point has several options. So I think this captures a lot of the other ones that we were talking about. So no more than 2.5 pounds of waste per square foot of floor area. So just a comprehensive like, hey, just don't use waste. We kept the recycle salvage 90% of material per some information from the Austin Resource Recovery, building deconstruction with a detailed plan of salvage and reuse. So again, this is extending that building material life beyond the building life, which saves you the embodied carbon. Same idea on the front end, designing for reuse with a narrative description of disassembly strategy. So that one we kept as an option for here. Now looking back at this map, you can kind of see additional construction waste management, make it 90%, gets tossed in the CDW point. Building material use reduction, we split into a bunch of points, then kind of synthesize into the EPD and LCA point. Sustainably sourced material, that ends up going into the LCA and EPD points and then kind of gets synthesized there. Certified wood had some small addendums, and then the PVC went to IEQ. So that was kind of this is the mind map of what we actually did. So lessons learned about embodied carbon reduction in green building rating systems. We want to reduce embodied carbon emissions. We want to verify that with LCA and EPDs. This is a tangible way we can measure it. Let's make sure we're measuring the best. You can't really reduce something if you're not first measuring it. So that's the behavior that we want to incentivize. And conservation is important. So in light of everything that's like measurable and looking at the carbon numbers and everything, let's think back like nature. We want to save nature. We want to conserve, and it might not be as measurable, but it's still extremely important. And then it's important to include both prescriptive and performance-based credits to increase accessibility. So not making sure that, or you have to do an LCA, you have to do all these things, but providing some other pathways. And so while performance-based as verified through an LCA might be best, having an alternative for firms who don't necessarily have those resources, and making sure that they can still complete those points. Again, performance-based is better, so we're going to reward those more, but still providing an alternative. And also considering how hard it is to check or verify each credit. And so one of the problems that I had when digging into this was I was getting super excited about like, oh, like let's make this really complicated credit, but it's going to do such a good job of allocating the resources. But somebody has to check that and somebody has to verify that. And what are we going to do? What's the documentation? What's the proof? And so that's where it kind of gets hairy. So all these are kind of my big takeaways. But the call to action for everybody here who might not be working on a green building rating system is be critical of the rating systems, give feedback, say, hey, this is wrong. We should be allocating it differently. And a big part of that is considering what's rewarded versus what's most effective. We were talking about this earlier of is the green build, like no green building rating system is perfect, right? So what's being rewarded, what is actually achieving what we want it to achieve? And this goes back to some of the previous points of what's checkable, what's verifiable, how can we describe these points in an effective way? But as a user, are we just trying to check our boxes for the point? Are we trying to have an effective impact on the environment? What's the story here? And so striking that balance and considering that more comprehensive approach, I think can be really valuable. And do more LCAs. Tell your friends to do more LCAs, talk about LCAs, learn about the most advanced types of LCA. So learn about dynamic LCA. In my PhD research, I'm not going to go into this, but I'm developing like probabilistic LCAs. So really just do a deep dive and do more LCAs, because that's really how we're going to move the system, embodied carbon reduction mission forward. And again, let's not forget why we're doing this. This is in the Santa Fe National Forest in New Mexico. But nature is beautiful. Go out and enjoy it. Don't forget why we're doing everything.
That's great, Martin. You know, it's funny. You were just talking. It made me wonder, like, should we be pulling the other impact categories out into their own sort of, again, not to like take this straight to the credits, but should we be pulling again the numbers? I know, but what are the lead numbers? What are we? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there are 8, I think, that I see from the lead, including renewable energy demand and non-renewable. But, you know, should we be pulling those out and then having global warming potential? So you're running LCAs and you get a credit if you get 5% reduction in any of the 5, but the 6th global warming potential, there, you know, more credits or something like that. You know, is that, you know, just not that, you know, too late now, whatever, but living futures is here. So maybe that's the next, the next step or something if we do look at, but I think you're right. I mean, and in fact, I really like that living futures, you all went through sort of all the pedals, because it's very inspiring. I mean, I've never frankly had the pleasure to work on a living building challenge. I think we've proposed to some, and I've looked at like living communities and have sort of looked through the pedals a lot, but have never worked on the project. So seeing how holistic it is very cool, and how aggressive it is, which obviously I love, just because we don't always get to see that. We're, you know, trying to get one extra bike rack to get over a, you know, LEED silver limit, you know, just with like the developer client, and to see ILFI and living building challenge always just hits really hard, and it's always fantastic. But it just, Martine, hearing you talk made me think, wait a minute, what if we pulled those out and made them sort of their own thing? So something still to go after, because again, you know, don't tell the Great Barrier Reef that acidification is, I mean, I stay up at night thinking about acidification potential and health of oceans and stuff like that. It's all kind of interrelated, but obviously the warming is the engine that's driving so many things that are kind of going wrong, that you know, prioritizing that in a system specifically based on whole building LCA and LCAs for products might be something interesting.
Yeah, and I think the difference there is not necessarily GWP equals global warming, acidification potential equals Great Barrier Reef dying, but rather considering, well, to what extent? Like these are
Yes,
both significant,
right.
both important. But like how, and we've already kind of seen this with ozone depletion potential. So that's kind of getting phased out, right? And 2 of the reasons are, one, building emissions associated with buildings for ozone depletion potential just weren't that significant. So the first graph I showed that was like the normalization factor, like as a proportion of per capita impacts, it was really low. There are other, like, I think transportation was way higher for ODP. Second one was like, that's not a solved problem, but we're a lot farther along. And so when we think about what's neglected, because I said big, tractable, neglected, that's not as neglected. We've made a lot of progress there. So let's focus our attention elsewhere. And so you saw that get pulled. So there certainly is precedent for kind of tightening up the requirements. And I mean, if we want to say, let's just do GWP, I would support that, but it is, I think that would ruffle a lot of feathers. And so it's like,
well, just in its own credit, you
yeah,
know, you
exactly.
put the 5 in this credit, you give 1 or 2 points. You put GWP in this credit, you give, you know, 4 or 5 or 6, you know what I mean? Something like that. So anyway.
Yeah. And the step beyond that is a lot of these other credits are very regionally specific. And so we think about like, where is eutrophication most impactful? Like that might matter more in one region than another, but that requires somebody doing their homework and figuring out like, okay, what is actually the relative impact? And it's this huge step. And we think, well, how worth it is that step if we know that carbon reduction is so important?
Well, and as someone who runs a lot of LCAs and documents a lot of credits for different building certification systems, I chuckle because I'm like, you know, more complications, more regional priorities and that sort of stuff. But you know, you try to do the best with what you can. But this is very impressive. It was really cool to see both systems, and I think that you know, it intrigues me in comparison to LEED and to see where we're going. And I also appreciate that both groups sort of talked a little bit about the future and what's next. I don't want to dominate. I don't see any questions in the chat, I don't believe, but if anyone has anything, please feel free, jump in, give us a holler. We have great minds here to pull from. Okay, lucky for y'all, I do have something. It's interesting. I was thinking about Living Futures and the 500, what was the limit? You know, it was 500 kilograms CO2 per square meter. So while y'all were presenting, I don't know if I should share this, but I just will anyway. We'll see how this goes just real quick. So this is a carbon cap in the zero carbon. So that's for sort of an entire building, right? If you were running a whole building LCA. So I just ran one. I'm pulling from a project, and I think we're at pulling from a project that I worked on here. So I think we're running, I think this is a steel frame building at about 5.1 million pounds CO2 equivalent. And the gross square footage, so we're at about 72 pounds of CO2 per square foot, which is about right for a steel building. That's in the, if you push this to concrete, you know, usually I err around 100 pounds of CO2 emitted per square foot. So when you run those out, you're at about 345 kilograms CO2 per square meter. I was doing a little math while you were talking. So the cap is 500. So steel frame building is sort of under that cap. If we jump to concrete, sort of around 100, but I've seen higher numbers than this year, already at 473. You know, kilograms CO2 per square foot, pushing from essentially 475 up to 500 is a lot. But I guess that's just to say, if you're building out of concrete, larger building, especially taller building, thicker slabs, that sort of thing, and you're bumping up your you know, kilograms per square meter, pounds per square foot. You know, you're going to be bumping up toward that 500 kilograms CO2 per square meter as a maximum. So it just, you know, that's just, to me, was kind of an interesting number. You know, you don't see a ton of hard numbers out, and obviously the carbon folks in Washington State are rocking and rolling, and they're going to have another study out, which will give us a lot better benchmarks. But, you know, mine all come from just running these things on LEED projects and a few others to how they work out. But anyway, that was just a little thing that I was doing while we were talking. I do see a question, Mark Ledger. Hey, Mark, how are you? weightings for impact categories determined? How are the weightings for impact categories determined? What is the impact that they're calibrated to? And Martine, probably for you on that one, I'd say.
So I wish I had a good answer for you. I'm kind of relying on the nerds at the EPA and at NIST. But it is, I mean, what is environmental impact, right? And it's kind of considering ecosystem damage, these different midpoint indicators for like what's actually going on in the environment and how impactful is that, and come up with an assessment, try to relate them to one another. I'm not that kind of nerd. I am a different kind of nerd, so I can't give much more information than that. I can see if I can find a resource that sort of digs more into like their process and their weighting scheme. So let me see if I can dig that up and I can send that to you.
Okay, good. Anyone else want to jump in before we allow everyone off to their long weekends, hopefully? Okay, we'll take that as a no. Obviously, we're all friends, so anything comes up, let us know. Favorite everything that we put in the chat, please. There's some great stuff there, and I hope, I know many of us will work on an AAG building very soon, so I appreciate that. I hope we're all lucky enough to work on a living building challenge or one of those flavors sometime in the future.
I do have a question. When are the edits to the AGB expected to roll out?
I'm going to jump in here. This is Greg Archangeli from the Carbon Leadership Forum at Austin Hub, but I'm also, my other hat is utility strategist with Austin Energy Building. It's going to be this summer is the strongest commitment. It's getting quite close, but we don't have a specific date. But by the end of December.
It's like our next meeting, early fall-ish.
Yeah.
We're looking forward for this to come out.
Yeah, definitely. So are we, Greg. No pressure. But you got a lot of interested AE teams looking forward to the next rendition here.
So I have a little bit of more of a coherent response to Mark's question, super quick. So when we look at all the different, so like acidification, global warming potential, eutrophication, those things, those are midpoint indicators. And so that's something that's kind of measurable, but an endpoint indicator is what we actually care about. So we don't care about the fact that CO2 goes into the atmosphere. We care about the effect of CO2 once it's in the atmosphere. And basically the endpoint impacts that are being considered are ecosystem damage and human health damage. And so each of those are rated according to how are they damaging ecosystems, how are they damaging human health, and that's how the relative importance is sort of figured out. And so through that analysis, that's where you come up with, okay, global warming potential is doing a lot more than these other ones. Again, it's tough comparison, but trust the EPA and NIST nerds that they did a good job.
At some point, Martin, we're just gonna get as many CLF groups as we can and just have you do an hour on whatever you're doing out there, Boulder, and you can just get deep into it, man. We'll just give you an hour and a half, and you could just go crazy someday. So
sounds fantastic.
Yeah,
I'm in.
Yeah. We'll let you go deep into the machine on some of your research. So, yeah, we have a link share request, Martine, for that. If you have something pulled up in the chat, or else we can always email it.
I'll email something to y'all,
Okay.
and then you can forward it to everybody.
Okay, so Yuri, we'll get that out. The Martine Hour of Knowledge. Yeah, we'll do that at some point. So, okay, y'all. Thanks for everyone showing up, and look out for an email. We'll get a recording of this up and running on YouTube and post it to CLF ATX, and we'll all be in touch. And this was fantastic. Thank you all for thanks for the presentations, and thanks for everyone showing up.
Thank you.
Appreciate it,
Thank you
y'all.
all for your
Have a great
time.
weekend. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.